Hi, this is Alex from BlueGate Studios, and today we're going to be doing a mix overview of a new upcoming song from Chaain called Fusion. And I kind of wanted to go a little in depth with this one because there's a lot of tricky low mids and masking issues that I ran into, and I wanted to show you guys how I overcame that and created a little bit more space for these instruments. But I'll play you a little bit of the song here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about.
Streetlights could fade, it will remain the same till it falls through your hands. Do you know the taste? Do you know what it takes to hold the world from crashing down? Can you hear me?
The first thing is actually a trick that I found out from a friend long time ago. It's not really exclusive to Ableton users, but it's a lot easier to do in Ableton because of a function in warp mode. Over here under warp, you go to beats, which is automatically selected, and under preserve, you go to this transient section, and you can actually take like a drum sample, or in this case what I did is I resampled my kick and snare here, just recorded it, and then on this new track put the transient mode on and turn the transients down to 26. You can go lower than that if you want, but essentially what this trick does is get you really fat sidechain to where you can sidechain compress, I don't know, maybe 20-30 decibels without it sounding super pumpy or weird or even super noticeable. Here I wanted it to be a little noticeable, but I wanted it to really have punch every time that kick and snare hits. So why I do this little transient mode here is because sidechaining to me doesn't need to engulf the entire kick or the entire snare. Most of the time when you're trying to make room for that kick or snare, you really just want to maintain that the transient. You really don't need any of this. Sometimes you can push too much of the sound out of the way, especially if you have a really fast song, high tempo, maybe like 160, or maybe something low in double time. There's so many drums happening with a lot of sidechain compression. It's just pushing all your tracks down so much. You can still hear it with good use of sidechain, but it can kind of get in the way. So this method is a nice little trick, and I'll kind of show you here. So for this song, I didn't really want the sidechain to be super noticeable, but I wanted the kick and the snare to really have that pocket. So this method works really well. I'm actually using a gate for the sidechain compression here. And as you kind of saw, there was about 6 dB of sidechain compression, but you didn't really hear it at all. And that's kind of the purpose of this trick. You can get really crazy with it. Here, I'll show you. If you wanted to go super crazy with it, it still wouldn't sound bad because it's really fast, right? And you can do this with a glue compressor. You can do this with practically any kind of compressor with a sidechain feature. So if you were to do this maybe on Pro Tools or Logic or something like that, what you'd probably want to do is similar to how I'm doing in Ableton, where you can kind of just resample just the kick and the snare or whatever you want to sidechain to, and take that recording of your kick and snare, which would be this here, and just put a gate on it and just make it super snappy, super quick, and just so it catches the transients. And then you could sidechain to that. And I have it muted, so it's really just getting the signal from the sidechain and then using that. Okay, yeah, let me show you what it would sound like more dramatic. So play it.
I know you're mine, can I make you mine? Let me heal your scars. Let me be a part of you.
Kind of adjusted the threshold started to get a little wobbly, but usually you just want to hit the threshold so when, right when the audio is going above it, it can start, side chaining it, compressing it down. But the floor is really how much of it is being pushed down, at least on the gate here. And if you want to know how to do that in here, you just do a normal sidechain in Ableton where you click on this right side, click sidechain from, and I'm doing it from the recorded sample that I got, or that I recorded. And we're just going to flip the audio. So it's going to be pumping it down instead of cutting the audio out. And there you go. For the drums here, I kind of went with a lot of the Ableton stock for some of the basic processing, giving it a little saturation. And then I kind of went into, this is one of my favorite plugins actually for drums recently, the JST clip, just to kind of shave off some of the, transients, but also kind of give it a little bit of like a high-end punch, which clippers usually give, as opposed to maybe a limiter, which shouldn't really affect your sound all that much, and unless you really smash it, you can get a little distorted. But here, the clippers kind of add a little saturation to it, and it sounds quite nice. And then Pro Q3, and this is really just controlling the low end of the kick, and we don't really want the frequencies around 40 to down to about 25, 26. We don't want that to kind of create a weird rumble in the mix. We kind of want to control it, so we want to just kind of boost it down, cut it down. One thing you'll notice too when you're mastering, or maybe you send your mix out to get mastered, some of these things will be told to you by the mastering engineer, like turn down the bass of your kick, cut around 25, 30 hertz. There's too much energy happening there. It's getting in the way of your actual bass. So here would be my actual bass, my low end. And I'm doing a little cut here just to cut stuff that you won't really hear anyway, just to make it tighter. But we're kind of leaving room for the low end here instead of really punching in from the kick. We're not cutting it completely in the kick. We're just kind of lowering it so it's not so thumpy. And then kind of lowering it here in the bass for the fundamental of the kick to come through a little bit. It's just little tiny things in the mix like that. A little cut here, or a little dip here, and let's see, little cut here just kind of gives that kick more of a pocket, and combined with the side chain and some of the things I'm going to go over soon, it just makes it sound really good. So the next thing I kind of want to go over is probably what I'm sidechaining. So you don't really need to sidechain everything in the mix, instrumentation wise. You can for more of like an effect, but here I kind of decided to do it like that. Typically, a lot of people just sidechain the bass and the kick, and that's about it, especially for like modern pop records. But I use sidechain quite a lot, and I don't think people use it enough or know how to use it right. And this is the sidechain method I kind of showed you guys that I use often, is by far one of the best for transparency. But here I'm sidechaining pretty much everything except for a few different elements. So I'll kind of go to the second chorus here and show you what I mean. So I have this, everything, all the synths, the textures, the bass, the upper bass sound, which is this thing. That's also being sidechained, right? But this lead texture here, this distorted lead, is not being sidechained. So and this is more of a creative thing where I wanted everything to have a little bit of a pumpy feel to it, except for this sound. I wanted this one to cut into the mix and just pop out as soon as it came in. So I'll kind of show you what that sounds like. I'll play just the first chorus, where there's a little bit more bare, and you can kind of hear it come in like that.
Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know the feeling that something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this. Street lights could fade and we'll.
We're just going to quickly go over some of the problems I had and why this song was kind of difficult to mix in some regards. And a lot of these sounds here, like the one I just showed you, this distorted lead, and there's this kind of texture from Granulator that I created. Which is actually kind of resampled pad that I made from one of my EDM songs. Love Granulator. You can get some really interesting textures and sounds out of it. Probably make a video on that one day and how to use it and how to use it musically, because I think a lot of people don't know how to use it musically, as opposed to just a straight up sound design tool. But here I did a little bit of imaging to kind of create its own space and just kind of boosting some things, but I wanted to find, yeah, so first let's go to this high one. We actually have Soothe on here. Yeah, so this is one of the things that had a lot of low mid energy, and something that kind of goes unnoticed until you're getting into the mastering side of things is frequency buildup. And frequency buildup in this song, if I were to put let me just find an EQ really quick. Let me go into Q8. So I go into the master of the song, right?
Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know.
Oh, right now it's attenuated, but around this kind of 100 to 300 hertz range. Before I did the attenuation for a bunch of different instruments here, it kind of peaked a lot, and people don't realize that throughout the mix, you know, you're compressing signals, you're pushing things up into the mastering stage, and frequency buildup can cause a lot of boxiness in that area, and it's a lot harder to hear when you've been mixing or, you know, listening to the song for a while. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're, you know, in production, if you're making the song or you're mixing going into the mix. You want to kind of identify what sounds could be problematic and what sounds could build up like that potentially and clash, and deal with it. A lot of times people just focus on the low end and making sure that, you know, the only thing that hits there is the kick and the bass, which is a topic for another video, because I'm not really a fan of cutting low end on everything. For example, what is this? I want to find, I think here, this thing, right? We have some bass frequencies happening here. Around 100 hertz. I lowered it a little bit, but I didn't cut it, right? And you heard here in the mix, it doesn't actually really clash with the sub, because the sub is a little lower than that. But there's a little overlap, but it's not too crazy. And without that 100 hertz, it would just kind of sound flat and weightless. I don't really want to do that to this sound, because then it'll really get lost in this mix. Never really saw that as a problem. Maybe just turning it down a little bit, and in this mid section here at around 500 hertz. But then we go into this pad, right? This pad here, and I'll show you that at around, I don't know, 100 hertz, it starts to build up, but then at around 300, 400, 500, it starts to build a lot, and there's a little bit too much happening there, and That range is usually known for its muddiness, especially when it builds up, so you can kind of hear it here. It's soloed, it's actually not that bad, and it's hard to hear this problem in solo, right? Because we want the sound to be thick, and it sounds thick in solo, and that frequency range doesn't seem like it's a problem, but when you add a bunch of other instruments that have that, it becomes a problem. So we go into soothe, and I actually like this preset, the less mud on the master, because it kind of works around this frequency range, and you can kind of see it here, dynamically attenuating these areas. Not too crazy, just fixing resonances, so it's a little bit more pleasant with it off. Not super noticeable, right? But over the course of a mix, when everything is put together, it's a lot more noticeable. Can move on from these a little bit. We can go into this actually. So this is the high bass, which I also put this same soothe on. It's not doing a whole lot, but just kind of keeping this area in check. And this 250 to 500 hertz range just could be a nightmare to deal with sometimes, because a lot of people don't know why their mix sounds kind of muddy, or things are not very transparent in the upper mids and high end, because that frequency range is being completely overtaken, and our ears are so sensitive to mid-range frequencies, especially low mids, that it's hard for our ears to discern what's actually happening in the high end when there's too much happening in, around 200 to 500 hertz. So we attenuated that, and that's pretty much it. Everything else wasn't really clashing. The rest is just kind of focusing on creating space for the vocals, which is why a lot of these synths are kind of wide. Like here, if I go to this pad, you can kind of hear it's left and right, right? So far left, far right. Same with maybe this pad. The delay is kind of making it wide, but actually made it a little bit more condensed. Just to kind of give the other stuff happening on the far left and right a little bit more room. This drum loop thing, I didn't really want it to be down the middle, because I wanted it to stay away from the vocals, and we already had the kick there and the other hi-hat, and then you'll later see the shaker. So it'll be this thing. And in context.
Let me be a part of you.
Okay, so another thing I want to talk about too really quickly before we go into the vocals, the meat of this, is let's talk about the snare, right? So you might have noticed that the snare is really, really wide. How did I do that? I didn't want it to be in the middle. Didn't want it to clash with the vocals. They're around the same frequency range as like her voice, and kind of gets in the way of the transparency. And a lot of the stuff in the song is really wide, so I kind of wanted her vocals to be in the middle, except for maybe her doubles here and there. But how do I do this, right? It's the Haas effect, short and simple. I duplicated the track, and in Ableton, if you hit this D button, and it'll bring up the delay in milliseconds for each track. And so I'll just label one left, one right, and delay it at around 12 to about 17 milliseconds. And a good way to test if you're not phasing when you're doing this is you can throw a utility on here. I like to group them together afterwards. So it's one, or you can bust it out in another audio program. But you can solo it and condense the mono and listen to it. It's not too bad. We're not really listening to mono that much nowadays, so it's not going to be too much of an issue. Now, we don't want to phase, so we don't want this milliseconds to be below pretty much 12. But any higher than around 15, 17, you're going to really start hearing a delay. And I'll show you what I mean when, let's actually put this back into mono and bring this delay out to, let's say, 21. You'll really hear that delay. Right? It's not. We don't want to do that. So if you want to use the Haas effect and you want to get the phase perfect, sound it perfect in mono, which it won't ever really be perfect because it is delaying, you can just put it in mono in a group like this and just slowly mess with it. "11" sounds pretty good, right? But
something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this. Streetlights could fade.
sounds pretty good. One thing to keep in mind about the Haas effect, though, is when you have really short delay times, not only can it phase, but it actually makes the stereo field narrower. So I'll show you what I mean by this. It's not by a whole lot, but if I were to solo it and start adjusting this, and then I go up to like 18, it feels a lot wider. That's because your ears hear the delay a bit more and can discern from the left speaker and the right speaker. You can actually hear it, right? The closer it is to, 0, the more our ears can't differentiate the delay, and it sounds closer to it just being in the center. And this effect is really supposed to make things wide, and you can kind of play with it, right? But here what I found is I think it was at 13 sounded the best in mono and in stereo, and had the perfect stereo width to it as well. So I just kind of kept it at that and rolled with it.
Let me heal your scars. Let me be a
So to keep a note here, I'm also using the JST clip just to give it a nice punch, reduce the transients a little bit, and that's about it. Here I'm also boosting a little under 100 hertz just to kind of give it some thick low end. It's not that much happening here already, but you can definitely hear the difference with just a little boost like that. Really gives the drums more weight, and a lot of people would cut, which I think is crazy on snares, cut up to 100, if not 200 or 300 hertz on your snare, and you guys need to stop doing that. You're ruining the potential loudness of your track and the overall weight of your track by doing that. There's a reason why when you get your snare sample, if you get a sample pack, there's a lot of bass in the snare or a lot of upper lows. It's because that's what gives the snare body, and it's okay to lower it, right? So it's okay to maybe do an EQ move and do something like, let's make this a shelf, right? So we can do something like that and maybe just contain it a bit more, but fully cutting it is just never really a good idea. So I try to avoid that, and it also just sounds way better. And at the end of the day, sounding better is the most important part of it. So something you could do, you just drop a Pro Q3 or any EQ really that has a pretty steep filter. And we're going to go ahead and do a low cut. And we're going to we don't want a brick wall, we don't want 96, so we can do around 72. Boost the gain up like this. And we're going to type in here 26, or you could type in 25. Doesn't really matter. I wouldn't suggest doing 30 just because we already have a little roll off here that's that kind of comes with the nature of these types of slopes. If you really wanted to, you could do 36, 30 dB per octave, 24. I would usually recommend those for any kind of cuts in a mix, but for mastering purposes here, I'm going to do 72 because we're just trying to get rid of the stuff down here. Anything with a really steep filter slope like this, 96, you really start to get it. And brick wall, you for sure get it, as you get a complete phase shift here. And you don't really want that with the crossover of the filter. So it can result in kind of an unwanted sound, but usually we try to avoid that. So 72 is fine. Anything higher than that, you should never use it really. And yeah, I don't really need to use it here because I did it in the mix, which is something that you kind of want to keep in mind, is you don't want to go into your mastering phase of the song and fix problems in the mix through mastering. You know, having a limiter on your master track to push the level up to where, you know, it's going to be when the song is mastered is good every now and then throughout the process of your mixing stage, to see how maybe your drum levels will go into the limiter. You know, what your crest factor is. Crest factor meaning your loudest instruments versus your quietest, and, you know, the ratio between those two. Good crest factor would have the drum transients and maybe other transients really kind of baked into the rest of the core part of the sound, which in this case it is. I mean, we have the snare and the kick on top of the mix here. It's the loudest parts of the mix, but they're not really. I think the swing is about 3 dB, which is what you kind of want to see on, you know, consoles. You'd kind of want to see that 3 dB swing on a mix. That was the sweet spot. Nowadays, with things being super compressed and limited, maybe you can get away with like a 2 dB swing, but all that really means is that your drums are swinging about 2 dB above the rest of the core part of your mix. So we're going to go ahead and listen to that right now. And
you're mine, can I make you mine? Let me heal your scars. Let me be a part of you.
So we're hitting about 0, and then it's swinging from 0 to 3 here. Anything that went above was just probably some weird artifacts from me streaming it right now, but it's about a 3 dB swing, which is kind of what I wanted to aim for here. But how I got the drums to sound like it's more on top is, you know, through the use of limiting, saturation here, and then clipping. So just reducing the peak, but overall loudness of the sound goes up. It's reducing dynamics. And the name of the game in mixing is reducing dynamics, but maintaining its perceptive dynamic qualities. You want to make it seem more dynamic than it is by reducing it. The irony of mixing, and it's kind of strange, but, you know, makes it sound better. So for the vocals in this song, I can't show you the exact specific chain because we actually did a lot of the vocal processing through outboard gear. A lot of the compression is going to the Manley Varimu compressor, so it's really kind of giving it that sound. And a lot of the EQing on her voice was done with the Neve 1073 preamp, like actually on the preamp. And when we printed the vocals out through the Manley, it already sounded ready. So just really threw an auto tune, and I did freeze and flatten this because of processing power. But what I did here on a lot of the vocals was I actually, I'll show you, I didn't freeze and flatten this one, but I used TDR Nova, and around that kind of 200 to 500 hertz range, I just did a little dynamic processing. just to kind of push that area down when it became too much of a problem. And I did do it here on the main chorus and pretty much everything that had those resonances, because I didn't want them to build up too much, especially with the other instruments. But in something like a female's voice, right, like Connie's, you can see that her voice kind of sits in this range where the lowest part of her voice is around 200 hertz. A lot of male singers, their lowest range is about 100 hertz. So that's where the warmth is, but it's also where, if you have a lot of resonances, can become a little overbearing. So you need to be able to control that. Cutting things is not always a solution. The only thing I cut here was below like 80 hertz because it's just low rumble. You don't really need that. But everything like 100 hertz and above is actually part of the voice. So you want to make sure that you're not really cutting any of that, and you're just kind of assessing what needs to be attenuated. And in this case, that low mid needed to be. So we'll hear what it sounds like.
Let me hear your scars. Let me be a part.
So let's talk about verse 1 a little bit. After the manly, I put auto-tune on it, and then I attenuated that 300, 400 hertz area just a little bit with a dynamic EQ, and just kind of made sure that it didn't get too crazy down there and that there weren't any resonances peaking. So let's hear that.
Let me in your heart. Wanna make you feel like you're a star. Take me by the morning light. Am I on your mind? Can I make you mine? Falling in and out of line.
You can actually see it here too. Those before, those peaks were a lot louder than the rest of the vocals. So you don't normally want to go off of what it looks like, because that's a bad habit to get into. I'm just using this as an illustration to kind of show you what I heard, and in this case it did match, but it's not always the case. And you might be thinking like, oh well, if you see it, then it's a bad thing, right? It's like, well, no. If I were to put an EQ on the master, let's just throw a normal EQ on the master, and we can see what's happening. Like, wow, like the bass is, this part of the mix is so heavy. Where's all the stuff above 10K? Well, the production of the stuff in the song doesn't really have much of that in it. And there are certain elements that are brighter than others, but most of the things in the mix are dark, and they were produced that way. So just because you see something and you hear, oh, things need to be balanced, therefore where's all the high end visually, you don't need to put it in. Use your ears, right? And visual aid is just that. It's just visual aid. It's not something that you should go off of 100% of the time. So yeah, attenuated that, and let's go back to where it was. The verse. Just made sure that everything under like 80 hertz is cut fully. And this is a big part of my vocal chain on pretty much everybody's vocals. Sometimes I use several of the SSLG channel strips, or maybe I'll do the E depending on, the vocalist. But you can actually do low cuts here, or, high passes. But here I'm actually doing a low pass. And this is where this plugin really shines, is kind of smoothing out the high end of a vocal. So let's turn it off actually, and you can hear this verse 1. Listen to everything above, I would say 8-9K. So that we're starting to get into the high end, the brightness of the vocal.
Can I make you mine? Let me heal your scars. Let me be a part of you.
So you can hear on her sibilants, like her S's, it's just a little too overbearing. And it makes it pop out of the mix in an unpleasant way. So when we darken it, we're not actually cutting. These filters don't cut. It's really just a low pass, not an actual cut. I'll kind of show you what it sounds like as I push it down. So let's start here, and we'll start darkening it. And watch how it glues into the mix more as I get to the sweet spot.
Let me in your heart. Wanna make you feel like you're a star. Take me by the morning light. Am I on your mind? Can I make you mine? Falling in and out of line. Am I on your mind? Can I make you mine? Let me heal your scar.
So we kind of too bright without any processing on it, too dark all the way, push to the right. But this sweet spot, which is where I had it at, roughly around where I had it at, is at 8K. That sounds the best to me. It doesn't really get rid of all the brightness, but it kind of equalizes it in a good way. So I think I had it on these in analog gear, and I just bounced them. So on this one, I may not have, or it just got pressed up when I did some more of this dynamic processing. So I kind of tamed it a little bit more. I basically did a lot of the same processing for most of the vocals. Where things started to change was when I started doing the delays. So these are really quiet. You might not hear it. It's just to kind of fill space, but solo it. We actually have some automation here. It's quite a bit of automation throughout the whole song, actually. Various elements of the mix, which automation is very important in your mix. If you want to have a mix that stands out, you need to automate. Automate. I did some automation on the panning, and then really just used Nectar to do some formant shifting to kind of make it sound a little different, more electronic. Saturated a bit to make it a little thicker, put a bit of a chorus effect on it, and just high cut, low cut it just to make it sound like it's kind of fading away, right? And it's so hidden in the mix that, like I said, it really just is for space, and it's nothing more than that. If we go down to the chorus, actually, you can hear a more prominent delay right down the middle. I'll play that here in the second half of the chorus.
Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know the feeling. There's something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this. Street lights could fade.
I thought it was actually a nice contrast to the really wide doubles on the vocals here and the wide instruments to have this kind of chorusy delay kind of fading out in the middle of this track. So that's what I did. One of the ways you can do delay in Ableton, aside from maybe assigning it to an auxiliary track here, which in Ableton they're called sends, or making an audio effects group with Control G and then duplicating one and having one be dry and one be wet, right? Turning one off and one on. You could do that, or for simplistic purposes and for stem purposes, I like to just duplicate the track I want to delay, cut the parts out that I don't want to be delayed, and just leave in the parts that I do, and then just turn one delay all the way up. One of the secrets about delays is you really don't need crazy plugins to do delays. Most of the delay plugins that you get with your DAW can do about everything that you ever really need to do, especially once you add some EQ, maybe some reverb, a little chorus effect, stuff like that. You can get almost any sound that you really want from those. And I try to do a lot of the lighter stuff like that with Ableton plugins, and then start going into maybe my VST3s, VST2s for stuff that I can't really do in Ableton or with the Ableton plugins, because I want to make the processing as light as it can be, so I can either do my mastering in the box or so I could master at higher sample rates. So I'll play the delay by itself so you can kind of hear. Actually, something to note too is there's a little bit of swing in her normal voice here. It would be this section here. You can kind of see this little section here. The vocal doesn't actually start for a few like a millisecond or two. So that kind of poses a little bit of a problem with the delay, because the delay wants to be on grid. So when you do this, it actually is a little bit better than maybe sending it to an auxiliary track, because I can time this vocal with the delayed vocal perfectly. So you can have the swing of the main vocal, but have the perfectly on time delay. And if you wanted to, keep that swing, I mean, you could use the delay like that, but just by not moving this over, right? But I like to move it over, and if I want swing, I can just delay the track on this right side here by 1 or 2 milliseconds, and it's usually fine. It's a little bit more consistent that way. That way you're not really adjusting, you're not finding exactly when, and maybe this is a little more off than, this section, because it actually is here. So this delay is even more than the other one. So consistency purposes, I just do it like this. And it just creates a really clean delay that you wouldn't otherwise get doing the normal methods. And I have another delay here on the bridge, and this one is a little bit more in your face.
I say things you never do.
You can definitely hear this one too. It's a lot louder.
I say the things you never do. I take the worst parts of you. Let's make a whole lot of love and break away.
So another thing too here is I actually originally didn't have this reverse vocal in here. Actually, this didn't happen in the production, but I did it in the mixing, which is this reverse. It's like a reverse reverb thing, and you probably heard of other people doing this, or maybe you haven't, but essentially what it is you're taking this beginning part of the vocal here.
Can you hear me?
The "Can You Hear Me?" We're taking just this little clip. We're going to put it on its own track. We'll just put it on its own track here. Let's just solo it, and then we're going to take a reverb. And we're going to make a long tail.
Can you?
We'll do it like this.
Can you? Can you?
That sounds pretty good. We're actually going to reverse. So we'll warp it, and we'll reverse just this portion. Okay. So now what we should hear is that. And all we're going to do is freeze it and flatten it. Okay, so I've frozen. We'll flatten it. Now we have this, right? This kind of jumbled up reverse reverby thingy. Where the real magic happens when you actually reverse it again to bring it back. Now the reverb is before the vocal, and at this point you really just want to time it. So if I were to mute this one and kind of solo this, it would sound like this, right? So we don't want the actual vocal in there. We just want the reverb from before. So we'll just find where it cuts off. Perfect. So we'll do that. Don't really want it to last that much longer, and we will do that. And let's turn it down by as much as what I had here. Maybe a little less. We'll do like 5, and we'll show you it sounds pretty similar. So. So we'll play it here, just adjusting the volume a little bit, and it should sound pretty similar. I think I used a different reverb for this one, but for all intents and purposes, we're just kind of showing it. It should sound like this. You can kind of drag on the effects, like if I wanted it to be longer. For my version of it, though, I think I used the Waves H verb for this because I really like the long delay of it in that reverb. I just made it quite short here on the rise, so. So it sounds pretty good. I really like that. We're just trying to give it space, right? We're trying to fill in some of the spaces here that maybe otherwise sound a little bit empty. That's kind of the point of these delays as well in the verse. The like formant shifted delay, or maybe even in the chorus, the ones I just showed you. We're just trying to fill a space so things are interesting the entire way through. I also want to talk about this cool effect that I did at the end. So did you catch that? At the end of this chorus, I put a phaser on it and automated the dry wet so it comes in at just kind of the very last few words. But as it's kind of giving this cool spacey effect to it, I also added a different delay, a ping pong delay, but it's kind of like fades into the middle, but this delay comes in and fades in on the left and right, and the combination sounds really cool. So play it again. And again, too, something in mixing is you don't need to have the same delay for every vocal track, or the same reverbs. You can combine different reverbs, you can combine different delays, different effects. It actually is better to do that because you want to create those differences and you want the listener to stay interested throughout the whole song. And keeping the same effects throughout the whole thing with reverbs and delays and choruses and stuff like that, it makes things sound a little dry. It feels like things are not moving along, and you don't really want that. So here, this is the only actual part of the song with a ping pong delay, and it sounds really good here. So, and at the end, we actually took part of the outro or part of the chorus, and we just used Nectar and did some formant shifting and just did some filtering and some reverb. And this one I didn't put on a send for the reverb. I just did a little dry wet because I kind of wanted it to be mixed in, sounding a little bit more away from you. Don't usually recommend doing that. I usually recommend sending your reverb and delays to an auxiliary track, or like I was showing you earlier, creating a new track and just doing a full wet. But here I kind of wanted it to be baked in, so we'll kind of hear that soloed.
Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building.
Doing a little automation
Deepest
too.
part of me, yeah, you know the feeling. There's something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this.
And in context,
I'm calling out your name from the tallest building. Deepest part of me, yeah, you know the feeling. There's something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this.
something cool too is really notice when you're mixing the interactions between certain effects, right? So for example, here we have the reverb baked into this outro vocal, but we have the chorus actually coming after the reverb. And this is kind of an old trick with reverbs, and some reverbs like the Ableton reverb, for example, actually has it baked in. It has a little chorus option. A lot of people don't know. A lot of my friends use Ableton are like, really? There's a chorus effect here? There is. Same principles as this, right? But we don't really need to use it here because I like to keep things a little separate with a little bit more control. But it sounds great to have that reverb kind of diffused in a more chorusy way than without it. So without it, it kind of sounds a little bit bare and uninteresting. So I'll play without it.
I'm calling out your name from the tallest building. Deepest part of me, yeah, you know the feeling. There's something's gotta give.
It's clean, right? It sounds good, but it's a little exposed. It's kind of just out there on its own and doesn't really feel like it has space. And what I mean by that is everything else kind of feels like it's fading away, but without this chorus, it kind of feels like the vocal just stays in place, even with the filter automation. And so I kind of wanted it to have that spacey, chorusy effect while it's also being filtered and while everything else is kind of fading away, to really make you feel like you're in that space where the vocal is just being pushed away from you. And that stuff is a lot more important than you think in mixing, which is why I advocate, to use filters like the SSL filters, like I showed you earlier, on the vocals here, right? Is usually what I do when I mix is I'll throw this on everything. A lot of the best mixing engineers will do that too. It's a little hidden secret. People wonder why. We may not use the compressor, we may not use the EQs actually, but what we will use is the filters. And something that kind of ruins a lot of mixes is the relationship between bright and dark, and not knowing how to create a three-dimensional space where things feel like they come right in front of your face and things really far away from you. And we want to create that contrast, right? Music is all about contrast. So a good way to do that, and probably one of the best ways, aside from using things like reverb and delay, is actually the use of EQ and your fader. Volume obviously is essential to mixing. Automating volume that's one way, but the other way is actually making things brighter and darker, and as simple as that. Something that I like to do when I get a mix and kind of assess what's bright and what's dark, what needs to be bright, what doesn't need to be bright, is I'll listen to a mix like this, and which I actually produced this one, but I'll be like, I want the hi-hat, I want this distorted lead that comes in the chorus, and I want her vocal doubles to be the brightest parts of the song. And I'm going to make everything else, I'm going to low pass at around 10K, 12K. And not a very hard low pass, but enough to where it creates that contrast. So when you have a bunch of dark elements, those bright elements that come in, like these double vocals and this distorted lead, really just kind of punch through and really give you the feeling that something just came right around your ears, right? So we'll hear that contrast right here, and I think it's best exemplified right before the second chorus that comes in. So I will play that right here for you.
Do you know the taste? Do you know what it takes to hold the world from crashing down? Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know the feeling that something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this.
So yeah, and the shaker here also is quite bright, but really here is just the shaker, the hi-hat, her voice, and a little bit of this distorted lead. The snare is actually quite dark in this track, relative to the bright elements. But if I were to have everything be super bright in the mix, sure, it might make it a little louder, but you're not going to hear this contrast. If everything is bright, then nothing is bright. You want the contrast so that the bright elements pop out more as opposed to the dark ones, which you do need dark ones. In EDM, it's a little bit of the opposite, where there's a lot more brightness overall. So trying to find things where you can actually make dark to give it that contrast actually would sound good. But most of the time in like pop, you're really just trying to pick the brightest elements and push those things on top of the mix. And you can do that for any of the sounds, really. I mean, you start a mix, be like, I want that to be the brightest. No, I want this to be the brightest. Maybe this pad over here. And just play around with it and see how that relationship between dark and bright feel between tracks. So, other than that, we can get into the volumes of everything. I did some automation on the volumes, like here, and I kind of cut things out and brought up the volume progressively throughout the intro, gave room for more of a punchy transition into the chorus and whatnot. But all in all, the production itself gave a lot of the dynamics and volume differences. I know one thing too here is that I did automate the level of the vocals at first. So actually we'll do it here. But I ended up just kind of making each one of these vocal sections its own track and changing the volume that way instead of kind of automating it up and down for different sections. Just easier control that way. But, using volume automation for, S's, F sounds, any of the sibilants is another tool you can use for sibilance control as opposed to maybe a de-esser. Another one is this, making things less bright before you do your de-essing can really help see when things are a little bit more controlled. Are the S's, are they really a problem? Because if they're not, de-essing to me isn't the best sounding thing for vocals. Kind of makes it feel a little bit muddy in my eyes. So the less I can use, the better. The more invasive tricks, the better. Even though, automating the volume of these S's can be a little time consuming and a little annoying, but in the end, I think it sounds a bit better as well. So, yeah, so that's pretty much it on the mix. The volumes of things are kind of adjusted in a way where I have the drums at a set level, and I'm trying to just bring elements in where I see fit. I'll usually do the kick and the bass, or the kick and the snare here, and then move on and add the bass, the two bassy elements, which are the high bass and the low bass, which would be these two right here, and working from there, add some instruments in, and then I actually put the vocals in last, mostly because I want to maintain that relationship between the singer and the instrumental when they sang to it, because they didn't sing to it with just the kick and the bass and the snare. They sang to the instrumental, and they had a specific volume that they were at, and they liked that level. So I kind of maintain that and mix the vocals in after, and start adjusting EQ moves and stuff like that as needed, and automating as needed. But here in this song, I actually didn't do much vocal writing, which I do a lot of in my mixes, but in this one I kind of wanted it to feel just smooth the whole way out, and the Very compressor felt so natural and dynamic already that I didn't feel the need to go crazy on it. So that helped out a lot in these vocals. Here again, we're using the filter on the doubles, and they are actually pretty bright, but a little brighter than the other elements, but not too much brighter. And then, yeah, so pretty much it with any of the crazy effects and little tricks that I did here. All right, so now we're going to get on to the mastering section. And this is a kind of a juicy topic, because I have some quite interesting views on mastering in this day and age, and I'll start with a few different things about how I master. And you don't have to master this way. A lot of people don't, but I choose to do this because I kind of see the benefits of, plugins and have everything on one project and being able to go back and forth between the mix and the master. And a lot of people don't really take advantage of that. And so if I'm not using outboard gear, which in this case I'm not, I mix this one at home. We're in the box completely. We're not going and exporting the track and going to a new project and mastering there. We're not mastering left and right, which we could, but we don't need to. Mastering left and right is something, it's like pro's secret, which can help, but if you're balancing your mix well, you're controlling your peaks well, drums don't have a crazy swing, things like that, when you're hitting your limiters, it will sound transparent, right? And if there's anything that needs to be fixed, the first limiter that you put on your track, when you start pushing it at like 4 or 5 dB of limiting, you'll hear the problems. You'll hear your bass distorting. You'll hear your kick get lost. You'll hear, and you can go back and be like, okay, well, the kick needs to be fixed. You don't really want to get into the habit of relying on figuring these things out in your master chain. But having that said, it's good training to do that, and that's how I kind of trained myself originally, to pick out these problems in mastering or in the mix, and fix them while I'm monitoring it in my master chain. So, and you'll be able to hear too, like in this track, I noticed that low mid problem was a little bit more apparent once I started reaching around like -7, -6 LUFS on the master. So I ended up going back and fixing that, and didn't fix it like that much. It wasn't that big of an issue, and I had already attenuated it a little bit. I did a little bit more, and it made the upper mids and the highs a bit more transparent, which is really nice. So something to keep in mind with the way I master. And yeah, so with that being said, the first thing I put on my chain always, and I usually don't have an always thing in my mastering. I do everything based off of whatever, track I get, how the song is mixed, etc. But I never want to have the exact same chain, essentially, is what I'm saying. But for here, this is one of the things I always put on, right? This is Goldfoss. What it's basically doing is trying to dynamically EQ your track or whatever you put through it based off of what the human ear perceives to be the best sounding. And there's a bunch of different controls on it. I'm not going to go super in depth on it, but mainly what we're focusing on here for a good mix is the tame feature, which is more so for tonal balance for your ears and what sounds better for your ears. And we're not actually doing anything crazy here, right? We're just doing it at plus 4%. So you can hear it a little bit, right? Let me play it.
Let me be a part of you.
All it is it's giving it just a little bit of movement in the EQ spectrum and frequency ranges of, like, I don't know, the low end, and I see it a lot dancing up here in the upper mids, which is good, right? It's giving it a more human feel to the track, even though the computer is doing it. It's trying to do that, right? Because sometimes things get a little bit too consistent and it starts to sound less human and more like quantized. So adding these little things can definitely help. I've seen people go up and down with like a bell curve on an EQ and just automate up and down, or put an LFO on it by, like, 0.2 or 0.3 dB at like various different parts of the EQ spectrum, and just to give it like variance, right? You don't really need to do that. You could do that, but this plugin kind of does it for me, and I find it to sound really good. So, and it's not doing much, it's barely noticeable. The next thing I do is if there's any tonal balance problems, or if I just want to make something heard, this is one of my favorite EQs for mastering. One day I'll have the real thing. It's quite expensive. I haven't been able to do an A/B test between the plugin and the hardware. But man, if I could get the hardware, that would be amazing. I use this pretty often in my mastering. Really all I'm doing here is like 0.2 dB, about 0.2 dB at around 1.3K of the low mids and the high frequency. So this is the low mids, like kind of above that muddy range that I was attenuating earlier. And at the high frequency, a little boost at 13K, just to give it like a little bit of brightness. Nothing too crazy, right? Just subtle things in the mastering. Next, I go into my first limiter. Some people use a 2-bus compressor or mixed bus compressor for this. And this is kind of giving the glue to the whole track, the first type of gain reduction processing you do. Sometimes I go for 2-bus compressors like an SSL or API, just to give it like a little bit of glue, or even the Manly Very But in this case, I kind of already got a lot of that groove and glue in the mix through a lot of like the sidechain things that I did, stuff like that. So really here we're just reducing the peaks a little bit, but in like a more transparent way. And I'll show you how much we're doing here. Yeah, so it's not doing like a lot of gain reduction, but I wanted to set the tone, right? Reduce it at the dynamic range a little bit because I wanted to go into one of my favorite mastering plugins ever, the Wise Maximizer. And where this plugin really shines is this dry wet for the parallel mix. You can really get some great loudness out of this by doing essentially parallel compression on the master or parallel limiting, but the effect that it gives it on each one of these modes is quite unique and can really add to the transparency or the width of your track or the punch, and you can kind of choose between this different styles. And I don't want to go too crazy on this, but sometimes when I do is I'll go like 100% like wet if I like the sound of it, and then I'll just do like maybe 25% dry, or 100% wet if it's just a little bit of an amount. because sometimes when you do like 100% wet and on the amount and the mix, then it can be a little too much and reduce the dynamic range too much. So we're trying to find that sweet spot, right? And this, I like the transparency mode on this one, so we're just gonna hear it with that. And see.
The tallest building, the deepest part of me, yeah, you know the feeling. There's something's gotta give. We cannot escape from this. Streetlights could fade.
All right, so I'll undo that, but you can see I moved the amount knob, and it sounded pretty good, but it was a little too compressed, like a little bit too much. So we don't really want that. We want to hit that sweet spot. So next thing in the chain is I kind of work from like an order of what I think it needs next, as opposed to like, or you need to do the 2-bus compressor first, and then EQs, and then you need to do the limiter or your real compression, and then some saturation. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need to follow any rule book when you're doing this. This is all based off of what you hear and what sounds best to you and what you think will sound best to everybody. Now there are some rules, like generally maybe you want to have your EQs before you start like hard limiting your track, but something to keep in mind is, like, say you turn up the brightness, right? This is where that theory kind of goes down the hill a little bit. Is, say you turn up the brightness on the track, right? Like here I did it a little bit. It's not too much, right? But if I were to go crazy like I did in this Mag EQ and like boost, well, it's still not that crazy, like 0.5 dB, but it does make it like a big difference. If I put this before a lot of the limiters, the high end would just be out of this roof. Once all the limiting happened and the saturation through like black box, it would just be unbearable. So I actually did just a tiny bit of EQ moves on the high end here, and went in to do my saturation. Went in actually to do another Wise limiter, but this one's a little less aggressive, with a different mode, because I actually liked how both of them sounded on it, and did a little bit of de-essing here, so you can hear that.
From crashing down, from crashing down, can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building.
Like, this de-esser is really not doing a whole lot. It's maybe just catching the sibilance peaks that are pushed in normally through the limiting, which is going to happen regardless. When you're pushing levels, you're bringing the sibilance up and making those a little bit harsher. So de-essing is really important in mastering. You can go off a preset like I did here and just start adjusting stuff. Presets usually just give you like a nice range and some band split options already made for you. But if you want to, you could throw in any de-esser, really. I like the FabFilter one. Another really good one is actually kind of famous, and I use this quite a lot in my mastering this plugin. But instead of, let's say you're using this, you can go into, this is a free plugin called Limiter Number 6, and I could turn off all of this stuff, everything goes off, and actually has this high frequency limiter, which is essentially acts like a de-esser. And people that know about this plugin know how special this knob is right here. Works just like a de-esser, but instead of like compressing it, like limits it. But it's very smooth. Does have a certain sound to it that's pretty consistent every time you use it, and I didn't think I really needed that for this track. This is really good for EDM actually. So using it there and knowing your gear and knowing your software and what it's best for, it can actually save you a lot of time. So knowing that I didn't want to use that, I went with the FabFilter Pro DS. So we did that, and it didn't really do a whole lot in terms of making it more transparent, maybe just a tiny bit, but I wanted to do the brightness, the sparkle of the song afterwards, because I wanted that to be the last EQ move that I do in the track. And actually I do have a bit more limiting, but this is more just like pushing the level by like 1.5, 2 dB more, not doing a whole lot. But I felt like after the de-esser, even though the de-esser made it really smooth, I was like, the track overall could be a bit brighter. So what I did was just put this Mag EQ, and it's kind of famous at this air band at 40K, which obviously you can't hear anything above 18K, but it's the curve that it makes underneath that bell shape that hits around like 17, 18K. Just that little bump makes it sound really nice. So I can play it for you here and kind of adjust it so you can hear what it's doing.
Let me in your heart. Wanna make you feel like you're a star. Take me by the morning light. Am I on your mind? Can I make you mine? Falling in.
Yeah, so we don't want to go too crazy with it. We just wanted to do little moves there.
Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know the.
Next, we're gonna go into this limiter number 6, which is I'm not actually using it for its limiting section or this famous kind of de-esser high frequency limiter. I'm actually using this as a clipper, and I don't really like digital clippers all too much. I like clipping through analog. I think it sounds a lot more round, and technically speaking, and that's what it does do. It sounds a lot better, but what this will do is just catch any little peak that goes above everything else that's in the track, and just make sure it sounds more consistent. And you can get a little bit more loudness out of the song by doing this, so we can hear what it's doing.
Tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know the feeling.
So it's not doing a whole lot. Like, you can barely hear what it's doing, but at this point in the mastering process, any more will just sound distorted. If I used it earlier in the chain, maybe, but I don't really want to clip earlier. I'm already doing a lot of my clipping on my drums in the mix, so essentially I don't really need it on this. I just like the sound that it gives it just a tiny bit, so I just put that on there. And the last limiter here is really just for final level and measuring everything. I'm not a big fan of transients mode, this like link channel thing. I usually have it off on every fab filter limiter that I put on. As you can see, I have many in my chain, and I have them off on all of them except for this one, because I actually did think it sounded a little bit better leaving it on a little bit on the final one. And I turn True Peak off on every limiter. That I do not use True Peak limiting. I think it sounds terrible, and I don't think that intersample peaks is a problem. Basically, for anybody that doesn't know what intersample peaks are, is even if your track is at, here it's at minus 0.01 dB FS, even though it's not clipping in Ableton, or if you're in Pro Tools or whatever DAW you're in, when you convert it to MP3, or these streaming services convert it to MP3, that after the conversion process, parts of the peaks, maybe your drums or whatever's peaking in your track, which, let's be honest, pretty much everything will be once it's mastered and loud, things will go above 0, and just barely, right? And you can actually see it here. There's a True Peak meter here, and it shows you what it goes above. But I'll explain to you why it's not a problem to me. I'll play it first, and so you can see how much it goes above 0 for True Peak. And this is kind of an estimation that it gets based off of what will happen when you convert it, but I'll play it really quick for you so you can see.
Can I make you mine? Let me heal your scars. Let me be a part.
This is actually a quieter part of the track, and it's the first part of the chorus, but really the meaty, louder part is when the second part comes in. So I'm actually going to play that, and I'll show you what it reads there.
Can you hear me? I'm calling out your name from the tallest building, the deepest part of me. Yeah, you know the feeling. There's something's got
So it's really not going above 0.1. Like, it's barely peaking above 0 in true peak, which is going to be your inner sample peaks that go above 0, and it's really not a problem. I've seen tracks, I've mastered tracks with a true peak reading that goes 2 or 3 dB above 0, and you might be like, that's absolutely insane. If your track is going 2 to 3 above 0, isn't it going to distort? Isn't it going to clip when you play it in certain speakers? The short answer, yes. The long answer, shortened, could also be not really. And why I say that is because technically speaking, it does clip and it will go above 0, but it's so unnoticeable, even at loud volumes on systems, that you're not going to hear it. And at the end of the day, if you don't hear it, then why do something that's a detriment to your master? And a lot of the true peak limiters just do not sound good. Maybe in the future they'll sound good, but it's really not a problem. I implore you to test it and put a true peak limiter on. Maybe you have it on Pro L here, or you have it on a different limiter, and bounce one on your final limiter in your master. Bounce one with true peak on, one with true peak off. Tell me which one you like sound more. Which one sounds louder? Which one sounds better? Test it on different systems. Guarantee you most of you will like it with it off. It'll be louder and it'll be punchier and it'll just sound better. So my reasoning on why I don't use that. Not really that complex of a mastering chain. The mix I think is really good and all the balance comes from there. Didn't really have to do that many EQ moves. Really just limiting. I don't really see the use of a lot of compression in my mastering because a lot of the tracks in the song are already compressed. My drums have already been squashed. They already are in a good spot. The relationship between, the loud and quiet sounds are already there and established. And all compression would really do for me is reduce the dynamic range with a change in feel, because compressors have an attack and release that is not, it's musical, but on and it can be definitely musical in mastering, but when you add all of that groove and punch and feel in the mix and you like where it's at, which I think you should do all of that in the mix, then in my eyes, all that the mastering should be is detail oriented work, like little EQ moves, little things to make it sound just a little bit clearer, bringing the levels up, maybe doing a little bit of stereo widening, making sure things aren't phasing, which I don't have it on this mastering chain because I usually take it off. But one thing that I do use quite a bit actually is the Plugin Alliance BX meter. So I'll go and drop this in here, and we're just making sure that the phase is, in the positives, and we're not phasing at all. So we can just take a listen here.
Make you mine, let me hear your scars.
Yeah, so we are. We're positive, in a very good way. What you don't want to see is this going either in 0 or getting a negative at all. That means there's some phasing in your song. And if I were to guess where the phasing is coming from, it's either you didn't do vocal doubling properly and you just you just duplicated a track and then just pan one left and right or something like that, and it, you know what I mean, it'll phase. Well, in that case it'll just play down the middle, but if you do like a Haas effect or something, it might phase. If you I don't know, have a bass sound, a lot of the stuff in like Omnisphere, for some reason, like the low bass pads or like the bass synths are in stereo and cause a lot of weird phasing issues. Which is why like something like this, right? Like I cut the lows from this kind of upper low bass sound and just layered it with like a sub. So, and together they sound like this. So yeah, we're getting like that, the clean, non-phased bass going straight down the middle. We're also getting kind of a wide mid sound from the actual synth. without a phasing. So it sounds great. And again, we're adjusting that in the mix. You should be able to know at a certain point with experience if things are going to phase, and you'll use these meters less and less, which is a good thing. Another thing you want to do is, I always have a utility here. I did this for, it's a little gain reduction just for the final limiter, but a good thing to test is putting your song in mono and seeing if the relationships of far left elements, far right elements, the panning stuff that you have going on sounds consistent in mono, because what sometimes can happen is when you pan something hard right, it may sound great in stereo, but you actually lose quite a bit of volume in it when it goes to mono. So keeping a balance of left and right is pretty important. You can check that in mono to make sure it sounds consistent, and it's also a good way to check for phasing too if you don't have a meter. If things sound effed up, then you need to go ahead and fix that, and you can hear it with just hitting the mono button. So let's hear it mono actually.
In and out of line, am I on your mind? Can I make you mine? Let me hear your scars. Let me be a part of you.
It sounds great. Nothing like stands out to me. So turn that off, leave it in stereo, and that's pretty much it. One thing that I do use quite a bit, and I'll kind of go more in depth in other videos when I hone in on comparisons between certain plugins, is the use of stereo widening in this and mastering. And I didn't use it in this because I, mix the song as well. And usually when I mix and master the track, I'll do a lot of the stereo widening in the actual mix. Sometimes doing that and also doing it in the mastering can really help, but something I use quite a bit is Dr. MS by Matthew Lane, and it's one of my first plugins actually that I'll use. And you really have to know what you're doing with a plugin like this, because you can run into phasing issues very quickly, especially with injecting the mids or the sides into each other, which is what this field and focus section does. Which can make the stereo image of the song sound very unique, but it could also destroy it really quickly if you don't know what you're doing. But a good way to kind of test the stereo widening effect on your mix would be to adjust this side knob. So I'm just going to play it actually here, and let's choose a different section of the song. Let's do the bridge actually, and we'll just play with the amount of side, and we'll see if widening it makes it sound better or worse.
Worst parts of you. Let's make a whole lot of love and pray away.
So it definitely widened it, and it made the sides a bit louder. It's not really what I wanted in this. I kind of liked how wide everything was before, so that's why I didn't choose to use it here. So yeah, that's this mix in a nutshell. I wish I can go more in depth on the vocal chain that I used in this, but like I said, it was mostly outboard gear, so I didn't really use a lot of plugins for it. But I definitely will do another mix breakdown where I'd have the entire vocal chain. We'll do one on a male singer, we'll do one on a female singer, we'll do one on rapping, and to see how these things change between genres. And yeah, I hope you learn something and kind of come out of this with an understanding that it's not just technical work, that it's also very creative work, and a lot more psychological aspects of mixing come into play when you start understanding what mixing truly is. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
I say